Hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about how you can close a regression gap for DevOps and unlock more from your Salesforce with test automation. My name is Michael Dailey and I'm a DevOps consultant here at Provar Testing. I'll give a brief introduction to the company before I get started in the presentation itself. Provar was founded about 6 years ago based out of the UK in London, and we have offices internationally. We specialize in Salesforce test automation, and a lot of our team members here and consultants come from a background in both manual and automated based QA. Our community is constantly growing with well over 700 members, and we do have around 100 employees and 40 or so partners at the moment. We are a registered Salesforce partner as well, and we are ISO 27001 certified. So getting into the presentation now, just to kind of give you an overview, this is meant to be more of an educational, informative session where we just kind of talk through regression testing, the regression gap, and how we can improve upon some of the regression issues that we see come up quite often. So firstly, what is the regression gap? When we refer to the regression gap, what do we really mean here? So I want you all to think back to the first initial release that you had on a particular project, application, or feature, or whatever you might have been working on. So the first time you come out with a release, this is all going to be brand new code and configuration for that environment. Nothing there has been tested before, and it's all going to be brand new to that particular org or whatever you may be implementing. Every following release, of course, is going to need to test that existing code and configuration over and over again to make sure you haven't introduced any kind of breaking changes. This is really what we mean when we talk about regression testing. We're testing something that's already been tested. And so as you can see here, the pink is constantly growing because our existing code and configuration is always going to increase with each release cycle. And so the need to test all this existing code and configuration is going to grow based on the size of our application. So how do we handle this increasing gap with the need to test all of the existing code and configuration alongside the new developments and testing that as well? So when we talk about closing this gap, we have three primary options that we can really take to kind of mitigate some of the risk here. So the first option is that we can just add more time for testing. So if we just had another week or so to actually implement the QA and the regression testing, then we could probably get it taken care of in the short term. However, this is really going to slow down our releases. This is really going to add another week or so, or depending on how much time we add to that release cycle each time. And this is going to compound, and as you get further and further down the line, this is not really going to be scalable either. And it's going to consume a lot more time. So you need to actually carve out time for the QAs to really actually devote their time to regression testing in these environments. The second option here is the one we see implemented quite a bit, and that's just adding more testers. So if we had just one tester before, and then we added an additional resource, we now have two. And so maybe we expect to have double the amount of testing being done in the same amount of time. However, this doesn't always equate to that. No two testers are created equal because it's largely a manual effort. There's a lot of variables that come into play there. In addition to that, it tends to be very costly. So just adding an additional resource is, of course, very costly in terms of increasing our test coverage, and it's not exactly a viable option in the long run. And of course, we can't just keep doing this. Most organizations do have limitations on this, and so it's not really scalable. We can't just continually add more testers each time we want to increase our test coverage, and each time we want to accomplish more testing in the same amount of time. So the third option here is the one that we really want to highlight in this presentation, that is automation. So we want to take our existing regression tests and we want to automate them. So that way each release cycle, we don't have to worry about dedicating the same amount of resources each cycle to testing the existing code. So before we really get into test automation, I'll give it a brief definition here just to kind of give you an idea of what we refer to as test automation. And that is really just the practice of running repeatable tests automatically. The key word here being repeatable. We want these test cases to be robust, we want them to be consistent, and we want them to be executed in a way that we can rely upon each time. And so moving along to the benefits now of test automation. So firstly, the concept of repeatability, of course, means that we have improved consistency. We're no longer dealing with the human element of testing. We don't have to worry about the same process getting executed each time and whether or not that person did the same exact workflow in execution 1 versus execution 2, because we know they did in this case because it's all automated. So we know it's going to be consistent. Whatever happens, whether it passes or fails, we know it's doing the same thing every single time. And the next point here is an accelerated regression cycle. So the idea of test automation should lend to the fact that we now have the same amount of test cases being covered in each release cycle, and we can get more development done because we're doing it in a repeatable process in terms of our testing. And a really big benefit here is that it's fully autonomous. We can fire and forget. We can schedule these test cases to run overnight. We don't have to monitor them. We don't have to manually intervene to make sure certain data and elements such as those are in place. And this is also going to reduce monotony. So the QA task is traditionally looked at as something that can be quite repetitive. Maybe you're testing the same functionality over and over again. So this kind of removes that aspect of it and puts it in a more interesting light. So that lends itself to our next slide. We're really talking about QA being more of an art form. So at Provar, we like to think of QA as being really a creative job, right? You're thinking of all the different ways and different scenarios that you can run an application that'll result in different behaviors, and hopefully testing all these different behaviors helps to make your application more robust. And so we found these couple tweets here. The one on the right is particularly funny. I like it because it really kind of illustrates this concept in a metaphorical way. So it reads, a QA engineer walks into a bar, orders a beer, orders 0 beers, and then it goes to the different scenarios that you may think of. And then, of course, the first real customer walks in, asks where the bathroom is, and the bar bursts into flames. So you kind of get the idea here is that you can think of all these different scenarios as a QA, and hopefully you try to think of everything that a user might do or might accidentally do that would cause your application to behave differently. So when it comes to looking at your different testing approaches, right, of course, there's manual, there's code-based, there's declarative automation. These are the 3 main types that we'll be comparing. And so when you're looking at your testing approach, this kind of matrix here can really help you kind of figure out what the direction you need to go is. So when you think about the level of frequency of changes in your target application, as you go from low to high, the need for automation arises because you really just have more changes coming through. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's once a month, whatever that frequency is. Doing those same test cases over and over again is going to be more of a requirement as your frequency grows, just based on the workload of the QAs and all the testing that you need to do for each particular release or change. And then, of course, on the left side here, we have the level of customization. So how much customization you have in terms of your configuration and your code and all of that is going to also increase with the level of need for automation in those respective environments, because the number of customized elements that you may have is going to make your manual tests a lot more complex, and that's going to make things behave in a way that aren't necessarily determined. So on the right here, we have another grid where we talk about the impact on the business that a particular test or workflow may have. So depending on what the operation or workflow is, the level of impact that it has on the business, you really want this to kind of be tested in a very consistent and reliable way. You don't want there to be any kind of human error behind it or any kind of inconsistency with the way the test case is ran. So automation is really good for that because it's very consistent. It's meant to be reliable, robust, and adaptable to change. And then when we talk about the level of complexity, we're really talking about the level of code in that environment. So that, again, with the level of customization kind of goes hand in hand there. As those increase, the need for automation increases as well, because we're having a lot more complex workflows that we need to work through and that we need to automate. Those kinds of business processes are definitely best left to automation. And so when we talk about the different testing approaches, the first one here that we wanted to talk about is code-based test automation. So this little code snippet here just kind of shows you an example of what it might look like to log into the Salesforce application, retrieving a username and password from an Excel file. And this is developed in the framework called Selenium, which is an open source test automation solution. This right here is written in Java. So you can see kind of the complexity behind this. It's a very simple task. If you're not familiar with Selenium, all this is really doing is finding 2 elements on the page, One of them is the username field, and then it's sending the values to that field. And the other one is the password field, doing the same thing there. And so kind of the brittleness behind this really is that it takes a lot of code to do very simple tasks. And a lot of these pieces are not very reusable because they're tied directly to the particular elements in terms of their UI location, the way the page is laid out, and the IDs for those particular elements. So they're not very robust in that sense when it comes to testing. So then we talk about declarative test automation. So for those of you that are Salesforce admins, what we really mean here is that it's more of a click to configure testing tool, right? We want to be building out our test cases the same way we would be configuring Salesforce. This is all through points and clicks and configuring the test cases as we need them. So a little example here on the right is just showing how you can add a mapping to set a field to a certain value as part of your test case. So all the user needs to do this is right click in the UI what they want to do, add it to their test case, and then Provar will handle the rest. And so all this is done through the user interface. There's no coding needed. You don't need to be a programmer to build out these test cases, and they still have the same level of execution, and they have even more robustness when it comes to actually executing over time. And so talking a little bit more about code-based test automation, as you can kind of see, it has very minimal transparency, right? So we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. Unless we're the actual developer who wrote the code, we may not even be able to understand what they're doing at all. And if there's no well-written comments, then it becomes very difficult to kind of figure out what's going on under the covers. And also you can tell that there's going to be a lot of maintenance behind this code. So things are going to change over time. The page layout is going to change. So how do we maintain those kinds of changes over time to make sure our test cases are always passing if our workflow is working properly? And then you can also tell that there's really no specific or Salesforce native functionality here at all. This kind of framework doesn't really have any knowledge of the different Salesforce elements and features that you may be using, such as visual force pages, and just something as simple as logging in. You have to kind of create all these different custom methods and wrappers to handle these very basic concepts. And also, the UI changes, as I mentioned before, are going to be painful. So if the DOM structure changes, if element buttons, fields move around on the page, you have to restructure your entire test case to remap those elements and make sure everything is now pointing in the right direction. And of course, this is quite the opposite of what Salesforce is really doing. This is code, not clicks. So we really want to get away from that and move towards more of a declarative approach. So looking more about declarative test automation now, the test cases are meant to be human readable, right? So you should be able to build out the test cases and edit them in a way that makes sense. You should be able to look at the test cases and see that this step is doing this, it's setting this field to this value, it's on this page, it's clicking this button. Everything is very readable in the sense you can look at the test case and tell what's happening. And you don't have to be a developer or a programmer to understand it. And then also lower maintenance. So over time, these test cases are always going to be running. Each release, we want to make sure we don't have to always go back and maintain the existing test cases. We want to work on new test cases and spend more time on different things like exploratory testing and testing for different edge cases and that kind of thing. And then also it's Salesforce aware. What we really mean by this is that each Salesforce release, we want our test cases to behave the same way. We don't want to have to program Salesforce specific elements into our framework. We just want to be able to build our test cases on top of Salesforce and everything work in a native way. And then of course, we really want the page layout and the position of the elements and the test cases themselves to be UI agnostic. We don't want to have anything tied to how the page is laid out or anything like that, because that in turn makes your test cases very brittle and very subject to change and failures. And then of course, just like Salesforce, it's clicks, not code. So I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk more about exploratory testing. So some of you may have not even heard of what really exploratory testing is. So this is the real reason why you want to free up your QA resources for additional tasks. And this is really going to be kind of the edge cases. So thinking about those different artistic and creative ways that you can run an application or a workflow and account for those different scenarios. They're going to, in the end, help make your application behave in a more robust and predictable way. So how do we go about this? So the first thing you really want to do if you want to do exploratory testing is to create what we call a test charter. And this is really just a guide or a plan to kind of get you through what your requirements are for this kind of testing, where your end goal is, what are you looking to accomplish and will get out of this, what kind of different workflows or features are you really interested in testing in additional ways, what kind of data-driven concepts can you apply to this to make this a little bit more dynamic. And then secondly, you want this to be time boxed and you want to have a centralized objective. So by time box, we really mean don't be spending all of your time on exploratory testing because there's other kinds of manual testing that is, of course, very important to the business. But this time box aspect of it is we really just don't want to spend all of our time here. We want to kind of do this in short little spurts here and there to make sure that we're kind of getting where we need to go, but at the same time, not just devoting all of our time to edge case testing. And then this is one that I like, is that we have low documentation with exploratory testing. So of course you want to take notes, you want to capture the results that you're getting, you want to capture the steps that you're taking to get there. But in the end, these are the kinds of scenarios that are never going to be tested repeatably, and they're not going to be added to your regression plan anyway. So the amount of documentation is going to be a lot less because of that. And lastly, this encourages out-of-the-box thinking. This makes your QA have to kind of think in a way that a user may think of, all the different ways a user may think of, and think about ways they can break the application, think about the different kinds of data they can supply to make the application behave differently. And this really just kind of lends itself to creative thinking. So when we talk about choosing an automation tool, right, so we talked about the two different kinds of automation. We talked about code-based and declarative. So we talk about the different kind of comparisons that we can look at when we're doing a vendor comparison. So the first thing you really want to do is list out your requirements and prioritize them in a way that makes sense to your business. So think about the different things that you need and you don't need, and think about the different functional requirements as well as integrations that you may have. And secondly, this is really important for those of you that are doing any kind of regression testing in Salesforce, is whether or not the tool or the vendor is aligned to the Salesforce roadmap. And really what we mean by this is, if a Salesforce release comes out, how does that tool respond to it? Are there any updates associated with the Salesforce release for that particular vendor? If they're not, then you may need to rethink of how you're doing your actual comparison, because you don't want to have to develop changes to go along with Salesforce releases if a vendor is already doing that for you. So it's something good to consider there. And if you don't have an exact checklist of how you're doing this comparison, or you're just getting into choosing a test automation tool, or you don't have any automation at all, this is a good checklist we recommend to anyone who may be interested. If you just Google Salesforce bin, what is test automation in Salesforce and why does it matter? You'll find a very good checklist there that can kind of get you through the kind of different things that you really want to compare in terms of your requirements and different testing strategies and so on and so forth. And then lastly here, you want to organize your demos and your proof of concepts, and you want the right people to be on those calls so that way you can make the most out of them. Another thing to consider here when we talk about requirements is integrations, right? So does the testing tool play nicely with your other tools that you're currently using? So in this case, when we talk about Copado as a release management tool for Salesforce, we really want to see if our testing goes along with that. So in the case of Provar, we're able to actually link our deployments in Copado to our Provar test cases that we wrote. So this allows us to develop automation with a clear objective and run these test cases actually in our Copado deployment. And in turn, we can integrate our test results. And in turn, we can integrate our test results directly into our pipeline. We can configure quality gates so that way we can prevent or allow deployments based on these results, and we can really make the whole pipeline function in a way that it was supposed to, right? We can do our deployments, have our unit testing done, and then we can, of course, once we get to that phase, do our regression testing through Provar, get those test results back in Copado, and make actionable decisions out of those. So that's really the end goal here when we talk about integrations. We want to kind of integrate our deployment and our release management into our regression testing in a way that makes sense for our organization. So in summary here, we talked about how we can close the regression gap with test automation. We talked about the 3 different options for closing this gap. And we talked about some of the benefits of test automation, such as ensuring that we have a consistent process that we can run repeatably and reliably over time. And then of course, the ability to accelerate our testing cycle is going to mean that our QA for our release cycle is not going to be a blocker anymore. We're going to have more time for this, and we're going to be able to accelerate our release cycle, hopefully with less time dedicated to the actual testing. And this is going to be able to free up our QAs and our testing resources for other more valuable activities that require more of a hands-on approach. An example, exploratory testing and testing for those different edge cases and that creative out-of-the-box thinking. And then secondly, we talked about the different tools that you can employ as part of your testing approach. In terms of automation, the declarative tools versus the code-based tools. And kind of the benefits to that declarative side is that, of course, you have those easier to understand, easier to read and maintain test cases. And then, of course, we have the concept of being Salesforce aware. When Salesforce makes a release, how does this application respond? Is it aware of the fact that Salesforce has releases, and does it have certain things built into the framework to help us as part of our Salesforce testing, such as accounting for things like visual force pages, flexi components, related lists, tabs, consoles, all those kinds of things. We want to be baked into the framework rather than having to build out the functionality to handle those on our own. And then the technical challenges is another thing to consider here. So for example, if we're doing different migrations, such as classic to lightning, or we're doing different testing in a broader aspect, we really want to be able to incorporate our regression testing and help us solve these challenges by accelerating our testing and increasing our test coverage for these kinds of scenarios. And then of course, lower maintenance means less time spent on testing, means you have now more time for your actual release itself. So what are the next steps for here? So from here, I would really encourage you all just to review your own testing practices in terms of how much time maybe it's taking you to actually do regression testing today. So if you actually have a formal regression period, or if you have a formal regression testing happening, are you doing it manually? Are you doing it automated? And how quickly is that scope increasing? So in other words, how many test cases are added over time, and are you able to keep up with the amount of test cases you have to do over time with the current resources that you have today? And this is kind of more of a hypothetical, this is kind of more of an optional one here, but really exploratory testing we always want to encourage our users to do, because this really helps you capture some of those edge cases and those high risk scenarios in terms of the different workflows and the different ways that an application can respond to behave based on what we may consider something not being part of the happy path. And so we look at when you look at different testing approaches in the future, you have to find which one that makes the most sense for your current organization and your current resources. You don't want to have to go out and hire new resources just to kind of implement test automation. So you really need to consider, if you can stay manual, can you keep up with how quickly the scope is increasing? Do you see yourself in a year from now having twice as many test cases as part of your regression cycle? And do you have the resources to handle that and scale that out? And if you are considering automation, think about what makes the most sense for you right now. If you don't have any developers or automation engineers on staff, then can you consider implementing a declarative approach to repurpose the current resources that you have without them having to learn how to code or learn how to develop in a code-based framework? That's it for now, but if you want to find out more about us at provartesting.com, you can view some different blogs, webinar recordings there, as well as some different articles, and you can even register for some of our different leadership events. And you can also contact me directly if you have any more questions regarding the presentation or Provar in general. But for now, that's it for our presentation, and I thank you all for listening.